So today I just want to talk about why I use Vim and why I recommend it to people. Now, I'm not going to bring up the argument that goes something like, well, Vi is installed on everything, so you might as well use Vim because it just makes sense to learn it. Now, that is a reasonable argument if you're talking to someone who says, I want to be a system administrator. For those people, yeah, you probably should at least have a basic understanding of how to use Vi or how to use Vim, because in a lot of cases, you'll run across servers which only have one of those installed on them. So if you want to be using that server, you kind of have to know that tool. But in most other situations, if you're using, say, a desktop Linux system, you probably have Nano installed, or you probably have some other sort of text editor installed. None of my systems do because I don't actually install Nano. But if you've installed something like Ubuntu or Pop! OS or Mint or any of the more user-friendly distros, they probably come with something like Nano, or in some cases even come with a graphical text editor. So in those cases, does it still make sense to learn Vim? And my argument is yes. Now, even though it's not going to be the most productive way to work when you first install it, I still think that learning Vim is a really good idea. If for no other reason, then it's a really good challenge to actually put yourself through. So the first thing I want to say about Vim is it has a super steep learning curve. Now, I'm sure you've seen the pictures where it's basically the Vim learning curve and it goes something like this and just straight up. And then when you get to the top, it kind of levels out a bit. Then you learn a bit more about Vim, goes straight up again. That's kind of what Vim is like. It has a very steep learning curve. Then you get comfortable with Vim, and then the learning curve gets really steep again when you realize that you actually don't know anything about the editor. You kind of just know the fundamentals and how to actually use it, and the limits on what you can do. There's basically no limits, especially once you start looking at things like plugins. So my recommendation is, if you want to learn Vim, it's very, very rewarding, but don't do it when you're really time constrained. So for example, if you have an assignment due on the weekend, don't start learning Vim now and trying to write the assignment in Vim. Or if you're in the middle of a development job, don't switch over to Vim as your editor because you're probably going to get fired. I would recommend learning Vim as a secondary tool until you get comfortable with it, and then switch over to it as your main tool. Now, it might be weird saying that having a big learning curve is a good thing, but I consider this to be a big learning experience, and I find learning things like this to be really, really interesting. And I presume the people who watch a channel like this probably feel in sort of the same way. Learning something interesting like this is going to be a rewarding experience. Now, the next thing I want to say is about modal editing. Now, modal editing, if you've never used it before, basically means you have different modes for how you edit. So in Vim, you have your normal mode, which is just your general mode where you can like move around and you can run some rudimentary commands. You have insert mode where you actually insert text. You have command mode where you actually run all of the commands, and then visual mode where you actually select stuff. And if you're coming from something that doesn't have modal editing, so most graphical development environments, Nano, things like this, modal editing might seem really, really counterintuitive at first. You're going to think, well, why do I need to switch modes? And then you realize the reason why you have mode switching in there is because you're supposed to use something like Vim with your keyboard. Now, the reason why you don't need modal editing in most graphical editors is because you have this mouse and you're generally intended to actually use it. Now, some editors that are graphical kind of have a bit more of a focus on the keyboard than others, but the mouse is there in a graphical environment and you're generally intended to use it. You can use a mouse in Vim depending on your terminal setup and your Vim setup, but generally you're intended to do everything with the keyboard, and that's because doing everything on the keyboard is going to be significantly quicker. Now, it might not seem like it takes that long to move your hand over to your mouse and then click on something else on the page. But once you realize how much quicker you can jump to that by just jumping to it with your keyboard, you'll realize even though the individual action doesn't take that long, if you times that by 100 or 1,000 or 10,000, you realize that keeping your hands on the keyboard is going to be much quicker. Now, let's imagine we had Vim, but if we took away the modal editing. So to actually move around, let's just say we actually kept the Vim keys. So to move around, that would actually have to be on a modified, because obviously if you start typing in H, J, K, and L, and you don't have modal editing, those are going to be interpreted as just regular characters. So to move around, you'd have to do something like Alt H, Alt J, Alt K, and Alt L, or do the same thing but with a control modifier. And You can do that action with one hand, but it's not really that easy to do. It's much easier to do with two hands, and that introduces the exact same problem that we have with the mouse. Doing things with two hands is going to be slower than just doing it with one, especially for these keys that are sort of finicky to hit. So it makes sense that Vim is a modal editor, and once you get used to modal editing, you'll realize it's just a better way to work. Now, once you understand the Vim movement keys, the next thing that tends to stick people is the rest of the bindings, because they might seem to be a little bit weird, but you have to actually understand what they're, I guess, existing in relation to. So for example, if you want to go to the start of a file, that would be GG, and the end of a file is capital G. Now, those two might seem a little bit weird. I'm not sure why it's G exactly, but you might be wondering, well, why is it GG and capital G? And you have to understand what those keys exist in the same grouping of. So for example, GG is go to the start of a file. And let's say we do something like DD. DD is delete from the start of a line. Or we have YY, which is yank from the start of a line, or copy if you don't actually use Vim. Or we have CC, which is change from the start of a line. So the GG command exist in the same grouping as the rest of these things that do things from the start of a location. Or we have capital G, so that exists in relation to capital D, which is delete to the end of a line. Or we have capital C, which is change to the end of a line. Or capital Y is a bit of a historical inconsistency. What capital Y actually does by default is the same thing as YY, but what it's supposed to do, because it's a bug that's existed in the application for 20 years and no one bothered to fix it, is actually copy to the end of a line. So if we paste this now, I'll put it on a new line, that copies from this point to the end of a line. Now that is the only bit of historical inconsistency I know of. There's probably some others out there, but that's just a bit of an annoying one. Now another one is if we want to do paste, or we want to make new lines. So if we want to make a new line, we can press O, and that creates a new line below, and then capital O creates a new line above. But then we also have paste, so if we copy this and we do lowercase p, that is paste below, or capital P, that is paste above. So even though sometimes the bindings might seem a little bit weird, you have to know what they actually exist in relation to understand why they are set up the way they are set up. So I did mention earlier that Vim has this just massive learning curve, and you're always going to be learning about new things. And I actually came across this very recently. So there's two things I didn't know about. One was tabbing. Apparently Vim has a tab system, and I had literally no idea about this. I don't use it that much because I prefer doing stuff in splits, but I might have a bit of a look into tabbing and just see if I can, I guess, fit it into my workflow in a way that makes sense. And the other thing I didn't know about was the Vim terminal. So if you didn't know, if you just run the terminal command, that opens up a terminal inside of Vim. I didn't know about this. Now, Neovim and regular Vim do handle this a little bit differently. In regular Vim, it opens it up in a split down the bottom. In Neovim, it opens it up so it actually covers up the entire screen. But it's still a terminal inside of Vim, and I had literally no idea about this, and I'm sure there's tons of other things like this that do exist as well that I just haven't come across yet. So that's without even considering things like plugins. And one of the great things about Vim is because of how many people who use it and how long it has existed for, there is this massive plugin environment. Now, a lot of the plugins are kind of bad, or I guess maybe not bad in some cases. Yes, there's a lot of garbage out there, but a lot of them are super niche. So there's countless plugins for individual frameworks. So for some random Ruby framework or some random JavaScript framework, which I don't really think are that useful, but then there are other plugins which are just generally useful pretty much all around. So we have things like Emmet, which is honestly the best tool for working with HTML. I did a video on that up there. And also VimWiki, which is how I do my notes just all the time now. It's honestly the better way to do notes. Now, I know someone's probably going to be like, well, what about Emacs Org Mode? Emacs Org Mode is probably great as well, but I'm a Vim user, and VimWiki is kind of the thing I go to. And I've also done a video on that as well, so go check that one out as well. And if you want to go and find these Vim plugins, there is sites completely dedicated to just looking for Vim plugins. So things like Vim Awesome and there's probably some others, but Vim Awesome seems to be the main one right now. You can also find them on GitHub, but it's easier to just go to one of these big aggregation sites. And there are always new plugins being made, so if maybe there's some weird feature you don't have supported right now, but there's a couple of people who want it, maybe one of them are going to go and actually make it themselves, or maybe you could be the person who goes and does that, but then you have to go and learn Vim script, and that's sort of the only big thing I don't like about Vim. I don't like the Vim script language. It's kind of a mess to work with. I would prefer to have something a bit nicer to work with, but I guess we're kind of stuck with Vim script for now. Now, the other thing is that in Vim, basically every action you want to do is bound to a key press. So it's not like in some graphical editors where there's a bunch of things that you want to do that are maybe hidden behind context menus. Pretty much everything you want to do is bound to a key press. Obviously, there's also command mode, but all of those commands in command mode, if you really wanted to, you could bind them to keys as well. Now, this does cause a bit of a problem where most of the keyboard is being used, but luckily, most of the actions that are bound inside of Vim are bound to multiple keys at once. So even things like the movement keys. So if you don't know, in Vim, you actually can use the arrow keys and you can use the Vim key movement. But there's other examples as well where they're bound in multiple places. So if you override one of the bindings, it's not like you're actually going to lose that action. You just lose one instance of that action, which may be a little bit annoying depending on which instance you remove. But as long as you actually keep an eye on what you're actually adding, it shouldn't be that big of a deal. And one of the things I said earlier kind of leads pretty well into this point. So when you're working in Vim, you don't necessarily have to do things in the Vim way. Now, there's going to be some Vim purists who want you to do everything in the specific Vim way. Don't use your mouse. Don't use multi-cursor. Don't use this. Don't use that. You have to use Vim in the way that I tell you to use Vim because this is the pure Vim way. But you don't have to do that. Just do whatever you want. And the nice thing about Vim is you don't even have to use it as a modal editor if you really don't want to. You could just rebind everything and make it so you automatically start in insert mode and have no way to actually leave insert mode, and just make it so you can actually do all of the commands directly inside of insert mode. Now, I wouldn't recommend doing this, but if you wanted to do that, hey, that's entirely up to you, and it's your instance of Vim, and it gives you the freedom to actually do that if you really wanted to. And as I mentioned earlier with the mouse. Now, I use the mouse in Vim outside of habit rather than convenience. I just have, years of muscle memory actually using a mouse when I'm actually doing editing and stuff. So it just makes sense for me to sometimes use the mouse, and sometimes my hand is off the keyboard. Maybe I've just grabbed a drink or something and it's just easier to, grab the mouse rather than move my hand back to the keyboard where that's actually a bit of a further distance. So in that case, it is quicker to use the mouse, but only because my hand wasn't already on the keyboard. So using Vim, it gives you the freedom to do this if you want to, or you can just use Vim in the purest way if you'd much rather prefer to do that. It's kind of up to what you actually want to do on your system. And I think the last thing I want to say about Vim is about Vim keys outside of Vim. So there's a lot of applications that are built with, Vim key support in mind. So for example, we have things like Vimium or Vimperator to add Vim bindings into your web browser. You have things like Qt and Surf, which are browsers that actually have Vim keys built into them. You have ZSH, Bash, and Fish, which actually have Vim modes in them, or I guess Vi modes in the case of Bash. And I think ZSH actually is a Vim mode. I don't know what it's called inside of Fish though. I presume in Fish it is a Vim mode. Or you have terminal file managers like LF, Ranger, NNN, and obviously VIFM, which all at least have Vim movement. Or you also have things like Skim, which is a spreadsheet editor with just, it sort of feels like you're using Vim to edit a spreadsheet. It's a really weird thing to use, but if you want to edit your spreadsheets in a Vim-like way, Skim is probably a good choice to use. And there are tons of other specifically terminal applications that come with Vim support. Just because, obviously, if you're using a terminal a lot, you probably also have some knowledge of Vim, so it makes sense that terminal applications are more likely to actually have this Vim key support. But there are some graphical tools that do actually have Vim key support, and one of those is VS Code or VS Codium plus the Vim emulation plugin. Now, I've had some people ask me, well, why don't I just use that instead of just using Vim? Because it seems like a lot of the stuff I add into Vim basically just makes it act like VS Code. But what I have to say about that is Vim is more than just the Vim keys. It's not just I'm trying to make it act like VS Code. There are other things outside of the VS Code sort of stuff that I am adding into Vim. And if I was to use VS Code or VS Codium with Vim emulation, I don't actually get those. So things like Goyo or even things like Vim Wiki, I don't think I can use either of those inside of VS Codium. And I really want to be using those tools. So even though I might make Vim act in a way similar to VS Code, I don't want to be using it because there's other things outside of that that I do want to actually be supporting. And another thing you might ask is, well, hasn't a lot of the stuff you've said in this video been sort of true about things like Emacs as well? And yes, pretty much everything I said in this video about Vim is also going to be true for Emacs as well. But the problem with Emacs is the same problem with Vim. It is a monolithic learning task, and if I was to go and learn Emacs, it would sort of be like, you know, going all the way back to square one. And right now, I'm sort of happy where I am with Vim, and maybe one day I'll go try out Emacs, but for now, I'm happy using Vim, and I'm going to keep doing so. So yeah, that's pretty much why I like Vim. Now that ended up being a bit longer of a talk than I had expected it to be. I don't know how long it's going to be. I'll check in post. I reckon 15 to 20 minutes, but it seems like a lot of my videos are kind of stretching out to be that long naturally anyway. I've kind of got too much YouTuber energy and, you know, making the videos a bit longer than they need to be. But I still hope that the content that I've been making recently has actually been interesting. Yes, it's a lot of long content, but I'm not trying to just make content long for no reason. I'm trying to, I guess, it's not just padding out the content, it's covering extra stuff that I might not be covering if I just did a 10-minute video. Yes, I could just, you know, go over the bullet points of why I like Vim and make it under 10 minutes. Or I could say, okay, well, I've got the bullet points here. I'm going to expand out on the bullet points so you have a bit more of a context about why I use what I use, and I guess a bit more about how I actually think about the applications that I use. So I think that's going to be pretty much everything for me, but before I go, I want to thank my supporters. So a special thank you to Joachim, Craig, Nathan, Andrew, Monsters Up Here Road, Tony, Donald, John, Spagine, and Zilver. If you want to support the channel, there'll be a link to that down below, as well as my Amazon affiliate links where you can buy the gear using this channel, or anything else you want, and I'll get a small kickback for it. Also, go check out my podcast. That is Tech Over Tea, available on many platforms down below. And also this channel, if you're watching it on YouTube, it's also available on some other platforms like Library, BitTube, BitChute, and some other ones as well. So be sure to go check those out as well. Also remember to go smash the like button and leave me a comment down below. And remember to subscribe and ding the little bell icon down below as well. So I think that's pretty much everything for me, and I'm out.